Yeah, permits is something that I didn't have a whole lot of experience with. I had a lot of experience with ESA consultations before working here at Ecology, but we've had two recent spills that gave us all kind of a lot of experience applying for and gathering permits and just going through the process. So I'm going to use this 15 minutes to kind of go through the process from somebody who might not be super familiar with permits, and just kind of what tools to use, and how to make sure you're engaging the right people to make sure that you're getting the right permits to do the work that you need to do. And before I start, permits, they're important because they help us stay compliant with environmental laws. They're a really good way to incorporate subject matter experts and best management practices into a response through engaging with the people who are giving you a permit. And I had written down in my notes that they're a good way to keep us out of jail. But Allison, if you're on today, I was happy to hear you say yesterday that at least for ESA, if you are out of compliance, you won't be going to jail. That was comforting. But no, they're good to keep yourself out of trouble with, and in good graces with the people who are giving you permits and with the public. I'm going to talk about two tools in the area plan that pertain to permits. So if you went to the RRT website, if you click on the area contingency plan tab up on top, you get all of the sections of the plan. And then I'm going to be talking a little bit about 9401 and 9402. So 9401 is a permit summary table, and then 9402 is a tool to help you keep track of all the permits that you need for a particular response. So this is a page out of 9401. There's 10 pages in this section, and it's essentially just it's a table that lists all of the kind of usual suspect permits that you may need for oil spill related work in the area. So there's 15 federal permits on the list. There's 18 permits for Oregon, 2 permits relating to work in Idaho, and 13 potential permits that you might need in Washington on this list. And so a good practice and kind of how I used this list was, in the EU, we would take this list out, and we knew the scope of work that the response wanted to accomplish. And so we go down this list and we just cross off the ones that we know we don't need, highlight the ones that we know we do need, and then follow up on the ones that are questionable. If you think you might need it, it's always better to be more inclusive, give the agency a call, ask the questions, and be very comfortable and document your work before crossing them off your list. So that was 9401. 9402 is just a nice little template for how you can keep track of your permits. So you've got your the name of your permit or the number of your permit, the agency that's issuing the permit, whether or not you received it or if you got a waiver for it, the time frame. Some permits are good for a certain period of time, so you want to know when they expire. Some have a cost associated with them. Point of contact and phone number and email. You want to be communicating with everybody on your list, even the people who are giving you waivers. You want to keep them in the loop throughout the whole process, because things can change, and if the scope of your work changes and they decide that now maybe you do need a permit, it's always good to keep track of everyone that you've identified as a potential point of contact for permit work. And then there's a column in here for permit conditions, and I'll talk a little bit about provisions and conditions and permits later. It seems like there's a lot of them to fit in this little column, but yeah, so I don't know that I use that column too much. There's just too many of them to fit. Though one really quickly, so that 9402 in the area plan is a PDF that's not fillable. And so if you're looking for a template, the exact same template that is fillable, if we go back to that Oil Spills 101 site area plan, same area, go back to that environmental unit folder. And then up here on top is a Word document that you can download and start filling in. JARPA is the Joint Aquatic Resources Permit application. And it's another tool that you can use to identify the different types of permits that you might need for a particular project. It's a one-stop shop, so you fill out one application, and that application gets sent to all of these agencies listed here on the screen. And then they review your application. They ask you more questions if they need more information, and they make a determination as to whether or not you need a permit. This takes time, so to fill out and go through the JARPA process, it's not super quick. It's a very effective and efficient way to do it, but in a fast-moving response, this might not be the way to go. But you can use this list that we're looking at as a checklist to reach out and make sure that you're engaging with each of these agencies or groups of agencies for those particular permits. So you can kind of use the JARPA outline as a checklist to kind of make sure you're not missing anybody. So I'm going to go through the two recent responses that we've had that included permits, and talk about the permits that we got for each of them, and explain some of the differences in the response actions that made it that we either needed a permit for one and not the other, or vice versa, and kind of what those triggers were and what some of the reasons for needing or not needing the various permits are. So the Deep River barge and then the Pullman diesel spill, just really quickly, the main difference is they're in different regions. And so not only are you dealing with kind of different environments, but you're dealing with different offices within an agency. So you might be dealing with different people from the Army Corps or different people from within Ecology, different Eastern region versus Western region, or and those regions can have different flavors and different characters working within them. Deep River barge, there was no responsible party, but there was an FOSC. Pullman spill, there was a very responsible party, but there was no federal on-scene coordinator. Sediment and soil removal for both. Deep River barge actually went a step further in some of that sediment that they collected. They then wanted to discharge some of the incidental water that they collected back into the river, so that required another permit. And then the Deep River barge was adjacent to state-owned aquatic land. Pullman was not. So Deep River barge, one permit that was required was a use authorization. And if you look at the purple dot there, that was the location of the barge. Brown is private owned tidelands, and the green is state-owned aquatic land. DNR actually determined that the use authorization permit was not required, but with the understanding that the response would incorporate the normal land use permit provisions, and that we would keep them in the loop throughout the response. So I think that was their way of expediting the permit process. We still had to incorporate all of the provisions that they would have put into a permit. We had to keep them in the loop, but they were generous enough to give us kind of a waiver for that, but still counting that as an included permit because we treated it as one. Shoreline management permit project. This is from the city or county programs, and they guide the responsible use of shorelines. And so the goal of this one is to for the city or county to protect their shorelines and ensure that the public has access to public shores. For the Deep River barge, Wahkiakum County gave us an emergency exemption for this permit. And the reasoning for that one was, quote from their official exemption: actions that must be undertaken immediately or within a time too short to allow full compliance with this chapter, to avoid an imminent threat to public health or safety, to prevent imminent danger to public or private property, or to prevent imminent threat to the environment, shall be exempt. And so we got an exemption. It was still an official document. It had a fee of, I think, $60, but it was still something that we needed to cross off our list, and we continued to keep them in the loop throughout the process. I'm going to skip that little story in sake of time. WDFW land access permit. So you can see in the picture there, that's the barge that was on the Deep River. It was, the Unified Command talked about different ways to dispose and get rid of that pollution source, and the best way to do it was to use a nearby WDFW parking lot, and it's a boat ramp. They didn't use the boat launch to take it out, but it's the parking lot for a boat launch. And so normally public would be using that boat ramp, using that parking lot to park their cars and trailers as they go boating. Obviously you can't do that with these operations going on, so we needed to get a permit and permission from WDFW to use their parking lot. And the permit had various provisions. We had to define the dates of use. It had the terms of use. For example, all the work had to be done on covered surfaces. As you can see here, they laid out some plastic wraps. So all these permits come with provisions or terms that, yes, you can use our parking lot, but you have to do this, you have to do this. And those are kind of when I talked about earlier about getting the subject matter experts advice and information into the response. That's one of the forms that it comes in, is these provisions and terms and conditions. In this response, once the barge was in the parking lot, it was then deconstructed. And so Ecology has a vessel deconstruction general permit. And you can imagine deconstructing a vessel is a high risk for pollution activity. And so whenever possible, you'd want to do that in a place that's away from water, so you don't have that potential to release contaminants into the water. If that's not possible, then there's guidelines and best practices to minimize the likelihood that you will impact water from that activity. And so this permit helped us do this work in the most efficient way with minimizing impacts to the environment. And this one's related to the Clean Water Act and the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. You might hear the term HPA, and that's a WDFW permit. It's a hydraulic project approval. And so when the work has the potential to impact fish, shellfish, or their habitat, you're going to want to engage with WDFW and get their approval and their expertise in minimizing impacts during that project. And so as you can see in this one, the top picture, that blue rectangle was the aerial view area that was going to be kind of cleaned up, the oil and the contaminated sediment to be cleaned up. Down there in the bottom is the side view. So you can see that work definitely was going to affect the bed of that river and potentially impact fish. And so some of the provisions provided in the HPA for this were all things to minimize the impact to fish, like keep your suction hose off when you're transiting the water column so you don't suck up fish. If you make a big trench, fill it in so that when the tide, or when the, yeah, in this case, it was tidally influenced. When the tide recedes, you're not making little pools that can trap fish and then, heat them up and cook them. And there was a bunch of them, I think, 15 or 16 or more things like that that really helped us minimize our impacts. Nationwide permit number 20. So this is from the Army Corps of Engineers, and nationwide permits they're general blanket permits that, there's 58 of these, and they're kind of reissued or reviewed about every 5 years, and they're good for 5 years until they're reissued. And so that when you apply for an Army Corps permit to do work, for example, in a river, they review your application and see if it can fit under one of these pre-approved permits. And that's just a way for them to save kind of administrative costs and make the process more efficient. If your project is really complicated and it doesn't fit within one of these 58 blanket permits, then they would have to do some sort of an individual permit that would take a lot more time. And so for both the Pullman spill and the Army Corps and the Deep River barge spill, it fit under the nationwide permit number 20, which is for activities conducted in response to oil spills or hazardous substances on the NCP. Okay, water quality certification. This is the state's opportunity to review a federally approved project. So when the Army Corps approved the work to be done on the Deep River, then they would go to the states to make sure the states and authorized tribes to determine if there's anything to add to the permit, and those entities could also disapprove and kind of put a hold on that work. So it's essentially the federal government has approved it, and then they're checking with the states to make sure that they're okay with the work too, and if anything needs to be added to the provisions, or if they want their opportunity to deny that permit. Okay. And then we also have the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. They were more consultations in the Deep River barge, and they're related to and required by the Army Corps of Engineers through their permit process. So when the Army Corps of Engineers issues a permit, they then become kind of federally connected to that project. They're approving it, so there's kind of a federal nexus there. And then on that one, they had the Coast Guard was the federal on-scene coordinator. So there's definitely a very clear federal nexus. And Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act says that federal agencies need to aid in the conservation of a listed species, and also they need to make sure that their activities don't jeopardize the existence of those species or mess up their habitat in any way. Oops. And then Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act says that federal agencies need to be thinking about the effects of their actions on historic properties. And that includes standing structures that are older than 50 years old, and also buried artifacts that are same or older age. Okay, so just 2 more slides left. I think I got time for these. Just a quick review of the activities for this one and how they're different. So remember from that earlier presentation, one tank leaked, contaminated soil. They wanted to remove the tanks, remove this piping that crosses a river, remove the sediment. That's pretty much kind of the scope of this project in a nutshell. There's no FOSC on this one, so there's no federal nexus. It's in Eastern Washington. So just dealing with the same agencies, but different offices within those agencies, and different people, sometimes different perspectives or interpretations, of their duties. This one had a very, like I said earlier, a very responsible party, working really well with, within the unified command. Kind of interestingly, it was outside of the area of the national, or the Northwest Area Contingency Plans, biological assessment and biological opinions, um, which is kind of moot because there was no FOSC. It was not a federal action. We weren't required to do, the ESA, consultation. But my last slide here is just, the two spills lined up side by side, the permits that were required for each, and the ones that were crossed out. Some of them are, pretty self-explanatory. For the first one, for Pullman, we did not need, to borrow, WDFW's boat ramp for that one. We did get 2 HPAs for Pullman. We got an emergency, HPA to dig those first couple holes, and I think we got a second. I think it was an emergency one as well, a second HPA to actually do the bigger project. Consulted with, DNR on this one, but it was not near state-owned aquatic lands, so they said, no permit, necessary. In this one, it was, Pullman City instead of a county. So in the Deep River, we were dealing with a county. In this bill, it was in the jurisdiction of the city. So similar process, similar waiver, but city versus county. Didn't have to deconstruct a vessel. We fell under the, nationwide permit number 20 for this one as well. We got Ecology Clean Water Act Section 401, consultation for both and approval for both. ESA Section 7 consultation for Pullman, I grayed out because kind of what we talked about yesterday on the training. We did it. We didn't need to do it. We weren't required to do it. We filled out the 9404 form, sent it over to the services. We got their feedback. They were, very helpful. They gave us some good information, but they also reminded us that, it was not necessary, and that we were outside of the action area for the, from the BIOPS and the BA. And I think I did it. I think it's 1:59. Any quick questions on these? One thing I would just recommend to, this is very much from a Washington, perspective. I think the process of identifying what permits you need and using the tools in the area plan apply equally to both sides of the river. And this is not every permit that you may need. So just being familiar with, your type of work, your area, and what permits you may need before a spill happens, would be really, really helpful.